Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 283, The Mythologies of Ancient Mexico and Peru. This is a 55-page work, so fairly short. Link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon, second and third links to my books blogs. This almost rounds out the Creation series. I've got two more titles within it, Mythology of Ancient Britain and Ireland, and one on the mythology of the Hebrews, actually. I've got both of those to work on next. The former I'm halfway done with now. This is an excellent little work. The first entire chapter is actually, at the time, within anthropology there was a bigger focus on spiritual things than there is now. Because in the wake of like the discovery of Troy and things like that, people are saying, well, all these ancient myths, there's a kernel of truth to them. Indeed, we found that to be the case, but interest over time has waned as science has moved more and more into the secular. It's more taboo now for archaeologists to act like Indiana Jones and refer to the Bible or something, which was their main text at the time, or the Rig Veda, even though they probably should, because that was the period of greatest archaeological discoveries of our history. I happen to be more sympathetic towards the religious people on archaeology than some, while being, in the scientific sense, completely secular. That being said, this focuses on the Aztecs, number one, and the Inca, number two. And the first chapter actually goes into like the concept that there was potential intermixture, and this is still debated today. You get the Solutrean hypothesis and so forth. Intermixture between some of the eastern tribes based partially on burial remains. I've actually seen one of the burial cairns in Vermont. There's several in southern Vermont, possibly from Ireland or of Nordic extraction. We now know, of course, and this was debated at the time up till the 80s actually, in the wake of Lanzao Meadows, some of these other finds, we know that the Vikings did make it to the North American continent. Back then they didn't know that. They didn't have these remains to study. They've been, again, continuously debated. Did they make it to Maine? Maybe they made it down to maybe Vinland was Virginia. We're not sure. And this is discussed in the context of the Aztec and Inca, but it makes the differentiation further that those southern tribes, it could not be argued, had any European influence. That is, it was strictly Bering-related, strictly diaspora from Asia, although it does point out that there are certain groups that have similarities in parts of further than East Asia that have Caucasian admixture, begging the question, of course, was there an admixture before the Bering Strait? It's possible. Genetic studies are ongoing. Anyway, it compares and contrasts these two religious groups. For instance, it looks more favorably at the Inca than the Aztec. The Aztecs were known for brutal human sacrifice, to the point where Cortez people, I believe, at the time counted over 100,000 skulls in one of their piles outside one of their sacrificial altar sites. It was common. It was a regular occurrence because they felt that the gods needed blood. In the Inca tradition, human sacrifice was rare. They generally sacrificed llamas or offered vegetative matter. Of course, these two cultures have further differences and similarities, and this text also does what every other anthropological text up until the 50s or so does, which is it compares these spiritual systems to Christianity and talks about how they had, in the author's mind, primitive forms of communion, ritual baptism, and so forth, pointing out that the concept of confession was there, although in the Inca sense, it didn't have to do with redemption in the Christian sense. Comparing them in order to try to find a reason to applaud them, and of course is much more sympathetic towards the Inca for various reasons. Considers them more civilized, I suppose, by early 20th century, specifically Christian standards. It's a fascinating little work, though. It's a very broad overview of some of the gods, some of the ritual practices. Of course, everyone knows that the Aztecs sacrificed regularly, but they don't know necessarily everything about it. And also, this is also an interesting historical piece within archaeology as an actual profession as well, because when you're looking at the anthropological side of it, of course, not all of the lore and ruins and so forth had been uncovered, had been properly transcribed, hieroglyphs and so forth, when this was written. So the interpretation that they get of these religions is in some ways totally different than what we have now. And so it's interesting to compare and contrast that as well. Of course, it's not a time traveler, so you don't have that contrast literally within this work. Again, link in the description of my edition of this work on Amazon, another Creation series title. They were all released in several very large volumes at the time. I might roll them up into a volume in the future. something even larger than their initial, I think, 2-volume set. Second and third links to my books, blogs. This goes squarely under the academic header, along with the other Creation Series documents. That's about all. Peace out.